In a quiet village nestled between rolling hills and fertile lands, two sisters, Amina and Zainab, grew up under the watchful eyes of their loving parents. The family home was humble, but filled with laughter and warmth. Amina, the older of the two, was known for her sharp intellect and caring nature, always seen as the responsible one. She took pride in her role as the caretaker of the family, helping their mother with chores and guiding Zainab with life advice. On the other hand, Zainab was a vision of beauty, a carefree spirit whose charm seemed to captivate everyone around her. She was younger, yet often the center of attention in the village, receiving admiration from many, especially from the young men who lived in the community. As they grew older, the contrast between the two sisters became more apparent. While Amina thrived in her academic pursuits, often praised for her wisdom, Zainab's beauty became the talk of the village. She carried herself with an effortless grace, and no one could deny the enchanting way she smiled. Men from neighboring villages often visited, bringing her flowers or gifts, hoping to win her affection. Their admiration was overwhelming, and Zainab seemed to bask in it, enjoying the attention and never turning down the kind words or compliments. Amina, however, began to feel a deep, growing resentment. She loved her sister, but the jealousy that simmered inside her heart slowly took root. Amina believed that Zainab's beauty was the reason she had been overshadowed for so long. It was Zainab who caught the eyes of the most handsome and eligible bachelors, not her. Amina's intellect and talents were often overlooked by the villagers, while Zainab was adored for her outward appearance. Every day, Amina tried to shake the feeling, but it gnawed at her, especially when she saw the adoration in the eyes of one man, Kofi. Kofi, a quiet and humble young man, had been a part of the village for many years. He had always respected both sisters, but over time, it was clear to Amina that he had grown fond of Zainab. He would often stand beside her during community events, talking to her in a way that made Amina's heart ache. Amina noticed the way Kofi's eyes lingered on Zainab, how his laughter seemed to sound lighter when she was near, and the affection in his voice when he spoke to her. In her heart, Amina knew that Kofi was the one man she wanted to spend her life with, but the more she watched him with Zainab, the more consumed she became with jealousy. This was when Amina's internal battle began, torn between love for her sister and a growing desire to claim the attention of the man she secretly yearned for. Every moment Zainab laughed or received compliments from others felt like a painful reminder of what Amina could never have. She smiled, played the supportive sister, but inside, a seed of envy took root, and she couldn't help but dream of a life where Kofi's love was hers alone. It was in this complex mix of emotions, love, envy, and desire, that the rivalry between the two sisters began. Little did Zainab know that her own sister's feelings for Kofi would soon spiral into a series of events that would change their lives forever. As time went on, Amina's feelings for Kofi deepened. Every day, her heart would race whenever he passed by their home, or when he spoke to her sister. There was a soft smile on his lips whenever he acknowledged Zainab, and the way his eyes would linger on her face made Amina's heart ache with longing. What hurt most was knowing that Kofi had always treated her with kindness and respect, but never with the love and devotion she desired. He saw her as the older, wiser sister, always turning to her for advice or help, but he never looked at her the way he looked at Zainab. It was during one village gathering that Amina realized the depth of her feelings for Kofi. As they gathered around the campfire, the soft flicker of flames casting shadows on the faces of the villagers, Kofi and Zainab exchanged words that seemed to carry more than just pleasantries. The playful glint in Zainab's eyes as she spoke to Kofi, her laughter that seemed to draw him closer, sent a sharp pang of jealousy through Amina's chest. She knew, deep in her heart, that Zainab had captured his attention in a way that Amina never could. Over the next few weeks, the rivalry between the sisters became more pronounced. Amina couldn't ignore the way Zainab would walk past Kofi, brushing her hand against his, or the way they would steal quiet conversations together under the shade of the village's ancient baobab tree. Zainab was unaware of the growing tension between them, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing in her sister's heart. To Zainab, Kofi was simply a kind friend who had always treated her with respect, never suspecting the inner turmoil her sister was experiencing. For Amina, each encounter between Zainab and Kofi only deepened her internal conflict. She could no longer bear the thought that the one man she desired most in the world was in love with someone else, her own sister. Amina told herself that Zainab didn't deserve Kofi. While Zainab was beautiful and charming, she believed that Kofi should be with someone who understood him, someone who could match his quiet strength with intelligence and wit. Amina convinced herself that, despite the love she held for him, her sister's happiness would be her own downfall. In an attempt to get closer to Kofi, Amina started to take on more of the responsibilities in the village, hoping that he would notice her efforts. She worked tirelessly, helping the elders, assisting in the fields, and offering her guidance in community matters. All the while, she observed Kofi from a distance, hoping that one day he would see the depth of her feelings. But no matter how hard she tried, Kofi's eyes never strayed from Zainab. His admiration for her beauty and warmth only grew. Meanwhile, Zainab, unaware of the simmering tension, continued to enjoy her time with Kofi. She saw him as a confidant, someone who had always been a good friend, someone she could laugh with and share stories with. But to her, there was no deeper meaning to their relationship. She was still young and innocent, caught up in the simplicity of friendship and love for her family, oblivious to the pain she was unknowingly causing her sister. The more Amina observed this bond between Kofi and Zainab, the more resentment and bitterness began to cloud her thoughts. She told herself that if only Zainab were out of the picture, Kofi would see her as the woman who truly understood him. Amina believed she deserved his love, that her sacrifice and hard work would earn her the happiness she longed for. And yet, every time she saw Kofi smile at Zainab, her dreams felt more and more distant. The sisters, once close and filled with love for one another, were now unknowingly competing for the same man's heart. Amina's jealousy slowly began to eat away at the bond they had shared. She no longer saw Zainab as her beloved sister, but as the obstacle standing between her and the love of her life. In the deep recesses of her heart, Amina made a terrible promise to herself: if she couldn't have Kofi's love, no one else would. Amina's obsession with Kofi had grown into something darker, a consuming force that clouded her every thought. She had spent countless nights turning over the same painful thoughts in her mind, unable to escape the reality that Kofi's heart was not hers to claim. No matter how much she tried to be there for him, to show him that she was the one who truly understood him, Zainab remained in his heart, shining with a brilliance that Amina couldn't reach. Every day, her sister's laughter, her radiant smile, and her effortless charm seemed to pull Kofi further away from her grasp. The jealousy, once a quiet ache, now turned into a gnawing, uncontrollable hunger. Amina couldn't stand it anymore. Her love for Kofi had twisted into something far more dangerous, an obsession that fed on the idea that she must have him, even if it meant hurting the one person who stood between them. She could no longer see Zainab as her sister, her best friend. Instead, she saw her as a rival, a competitor who had to be removed if she ever hoped to have Kofi's heart. One evening, as the sun set behind the village, casting long shadows over the dirt paths, Amina found herself sitting alone on the edge of the small river that ran through their land. The gentle sound of flowing water did nothing to ease the storm inside her. Her thoughts spiraled, her mind racing with plans of how to finally make Kofi hers. She knew she had tried everything: her kindness, her intelligence, her charm, but nothing had worked. She had seen Zainab and Kofi together too many times, and each time, it was like a dagger to her heart. No amount of waiting, hoping, or pretending could change the fact that Zainab had everything Amina didn't, and Amina was tired of being invisible in Kofi's eyes. In her desperation, Amina began to entertain the unthinkable. A cold, calculating voice inside her mind whispered that if she removed Zainab from the picture, Kofi would have no choice but to turn to her. It wasn't enough to compete for his affection, she had to ensure that Zainab would never be a threat again. She spent hours planning, her mind growing more methodical with each passing day. She started watching her sister's every move, waiting for the perfect moment, trying to determine the best way to make her sister disappear without suspicion. Amina knew she had to be careful. No one could suspect her, not the villagers, and certainly not Kofi. She thought about ways to frame the situation, to make it appear as though Zainab's death had been an accident, perhaps a fall while walking in the woods, or a tragic slip near the river. The more she planned, the more convinced she became that this was the only way to ensure her happiness. To make the plan more foolproof, Amina started manipulating the people around her. She began to feed false rumors about Zainab, casting her in a less flattering light. She whispered to the villagers that Zainab had been spending too much time with Kofi, that she was leading him on, making him believe there was more between them than there really was. Slowly, she began to shift the perception of her sister, painting her as someone who was selfish and unaware of the consequences of her actions. She made sure that everyone, especially Kofi, would doubt Zainab's intentions. Amina's deceitful words planted seeds of doubt in others' minds, making them question Zainab's loyalty and intentions. As the days passed, Amina's obsession deepened. She knew that once Zainab was out of the picture, Kofi would have no choice but to turn to her. She was the one who had always been there for him, the one who had supported him through every trial. In Amina's twisted mind, she believed that this was her fate, that Kofi was the love of her life, and nothing, not even her own sister, could stand in her way. The decision was made. Amina would do whatever it took to make Kofi hers. The thought of her sister lying lifeless, the village mourning her loss, no longer seemed like a tragic consequence, it felt like the only way forward. Amina's heart hardened, and the guilt she once felt slowly faded away as she prepared to carry out her dark plan. She would stop at nothing to get the love she craved, even if it meant destroying everything she once held dear. In her eyes, Kofi's love was worth any sacrifice, even the life of her own sister. The fateful day arrived, clouded by the weight of Amina's decision. She had meticulously planned every detail, watching her sister's every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the village. Zainab, as usual, was out gathering herbs by the river, humming a soft tune as she walked barefoot along the banks. Amina had followed her in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. She had already convinced herself that this was the only way, there was no turning back. The river was peaceful, the air still, and Zainab was blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked just behind her. Amina's hands trembled as she stepped forward, holding a heavy stone in her hand. She had planned it to look like an accident, a slip, a fall into the water. All she needed was one push, one final nudge to send her sister tumbling into the river's swift current, where the water would carry her away, leaving no trace of the crime. Amina approached her sister quietly, her heart beating in her ears. Zainab, lost in her thoughts, didn't hear her approach. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, but Amina knew what she had to do. Without a word, she shoved Zainab from behind. Her sister gasped, stumbling forward, her arms flailing in an attempt to steady herself. There was a brief moment where Amina saw the confusion and shock in Zainab's eyes, and for the smallest of moments, guilt flared up within her heart. But it was quickly drowned out by her overwhelming desire for Kofi's love. Zainab's feet slipped on the slick stones by the river's edge, and she tumbled into the water with a sharp cry. The current, which had seemed so calm moments before, now surged with a force that dragged her under. Zainab fought to stay afloat, but the river was unforgiving, pulling her deeper with each desperate stroke. Amina stood frozen for a heartbeat, watching her sister's struggle. The panic in Zainab's eyes was unmistakable, but there was no going back now. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, the water calmed, and the river fell silent once more. Zainab was gone. Amina stood there, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. A sense of disbelief swept over her, followed by a rush of triumph. She had done it. She had removed the one person who had kept her from the man she had wanted for so long. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning with the sudden shift in her reality. She felt a mix of exhilaration and terror, victorious but haunted. She knew that the villagers would find her sister's body soon, and they would surely think it was a tragic accident. Zainab had often gone to the river to gather herbs alone, so no one would question it. In the coming days, Amina worked tirelessly to manipulate the situation, playing the grieving sister. She wept openly, her cries filling the home she once shared with Zainab. She convinced their parents that it was a tragic slip, a horrible accident, and the villagers quickly rallied around her with sympathy and support. No one suspected foul play, no one could fathom that Amina, who had always been so kind and loving, could have done such a thing. She painted herself as the heartbroken sibling, the one who had lost her sister in the most painful of ways. But behind the closed doors of her heart, the reality was far more complicated. Amina felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was relief, a sense of freedom from the jealousy that had gripped her for so long. She had her chance now, Kofi was hers to claim. But there was also guilt, deep and suffocating, creeping into the corners of her mind. She had taken her sister's life, and for what? To win a man's love? To be seen, to be wanted? Her mind swirled with these thoughts, but they didn't stop her. They only made her more determined. Amina clung to the hope that Kofi would see her now not as the older, wiser sister, but as the woman who had always been there, who had been loyal, who had never given up. She imagined him taking her hands in his, looking into her eyes with affection, telling her that he had always known, that he had always loved her in return. She imagined the life they would build together, the family they would have. It was a dream that consumed her, drowning out the growing voice of conscience that whispered that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The villagers began to forget the details of Zainab's death, the tragedy fading with the passing days. But Amina's hope burned brighter. She knew Kofi would come to her. He would see the sorrow in her eyes, the love she had for him, and he would realize that she was the one who truly deserved his heart. The deed was done, and now Amina waited, hoping that her sister's tragic death would be the key to unlocking the future she had always dreamed of. Days after Zainab's tragic death, the village was still shrouded in sorrow. People gathered at the family home to offer their condolences, but Amina could not shake the gnawing feeling of anticipation that had settled deep in her chest. She had done everything, taken her sister's life, spun her web of deception, and played the grieving sibling to perfection. Now, all she had to do was wait for Kofi to come to her, to finally recognize that she was the one who had been there all along, the one who truly loved him. However, to Amina's shock and growing despair, Kofi did not come. Days passed, and though he had been deeply affected by Zainab's death, there was no sign that his sorrow would turn into affection for her. Kofi, devastated by the loss of the woman he had loved, distanced himself from everyone, retreating into his own grief. He wandered the village in a daze, barely speaking to anyone, his eyes hollow with mourning. He visited the river where Zainab had died, as if trying to connect with her one last time, standing by the water for hours, staring into its dark depths. Amina watched this from a distance, confusion bubbling up within her. She had thought that once Zainab was out of the picture, Kofi would turn to her, he would realize that she was the one who had always been there for him, the one who had supported him through every trial. But instead of seeing her as the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, Kofi seemed lost in his grief, unable to see beyond the tragedy of his loss. Every time Amina tried to approach him, to offer comfort, he would barely acknowledge her presence. He spoke in soft, broken tones, but there was no warmth, no recognition of the connection they once shared. It was as if Amina were invisible to him, just another face in the crowd of mourners. He thanked her for her support, but there was no sign of the affection she had longed for. Each interaction with Kofi left Amina more confused and heartbroken. She had given everything, her sister, her conscience, her own sense of right and wrong, all for him, and yet he did not seem to care. It was as if her actions had made no difference at all. Amina's mind raced with questions, with doubts. Why didn't he see her the way she saw him? Was it not enough that she had killed for him, that she had taken such extreme measures to make him hers? Wasn't that the ultimate proof of her love? The more Amina watched Kofi wallow in his sorrow, the more the anger and confusion inside her grew. She had expected him to mourn, of course, but she had also expected him to come to her, to recognize the sacrifice she had made. But instead, he only seemed to mourn Zainab, his heart lost to her memory. It was as though nothing she had done had mattered at all. She felt both helpless and enraged. Why couldn't he see? Why couldn't he understand what she had done for him? Every night, Amina lay awake, her mind spiraling. She replayed every moment she had spent with Kofi, every interaction, every word. She remembered how he had looked at Zainab with such tenderness, such longing, and how he had never looked at her that way. Amina began to wonder if perhaps, no matter how hard she tried, she could never be the woman he wanted. Was Zainab's beauty, her innocence, the thing that had truly captivated him? Amina couldn't bear the thought. Days turned into weeks, and still, Kofi did not approach her. Amina's hopes of finally claiming his love seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Her frustration grew, a bitter taste in her mouth as she watched him mourn. She began to lash out at everyone around her, her once gentle demeanor replaced by a sharpness, an edge that only seemed to push people further away. She tried to keep up the facade of the grieving sister, but inside, a storm raged. The more she struggled with her feelings, the more she realized that the dream she had held so tightly to was slipping through her fingers. Despite everything she had done, despite the sacrifice she had made, she could not make him love her. The reality was too painful to bear. She had killed her sister for the chance at his love, but now she was left with nothing but emptiness. She was no closer to winning Kofi's heart than she had been before. The emotional weight of her actions, the guilt, the anger, and the confusion, all combined into an unbearable pressure inside her chest. She couldn't understand why Kofi didn't see her, why he couldn't love her, and this frustration began to eat away at her, piece by piece. As Kofi continued to mourn his lost love, Amina realized with a sickening truth that she had not only lost her sister, but she had lost herself in the process. As time passed, the whispers started. Villagers, who had once admired Amina for her strength and composure, began to notice inconsistencies in her story. A few close friends started to question the details of Zainab's death, and suspicions slowly took root. Amina tried to deny any wrongdoing, but the guilt began to weigh on her, seeping into her every action. She could no longer escape the truth, and it haunted her. Kofi, once distant in his grief, began to see the changes in Amina. He noticed her nervousness, her evasions when asked about the night Zainab died. His trust in her began to erode, and he withdrew even further. Amina's heart sank as she realized that even after everything she had done, the love she sought from Kofi would never come. She had lost her sister, her peace, and now even the man she had hoped would save her. The truth could no longer be denied. Amina's world crumbled as the villagers began to openly confront her, their voices full of anger and betrayal. Her once perfect facade of the grieving sister had shattered beyond repair. Kofi, who had distanced himself from her for weeks, finally spoke to her in private. His eyes, once filled with confusion and sorrow, now held a quiet resolve. He confessed that he had known all along what she had done. He had seen the signs, felt the cold distance in her words, and slowly pieced together the truth about her involvement in Zainab's death. Despite the evidence, Kofi had chosen to stay silent, not because of love, but because of his own internal conflict. He could not bear to expose her immediately, hoping she might come to her senses. But now, it was clear Amina's actions had destroyed the last remnants of trust between them. Amina's heart shattered as she listened to Kofi's words. The man she had fought so hard for, the one she had sacrificed everything for, now looked at her with nothing but disappointment. He couldn't bring himself to love her, not after what she had done. Her mind reeled as she realized the full extent of her actions. In trying to force Kofi's love, she had lost everything: her sister, her own self-respect, and any chance of happiness. Her life unraveled quickly after that. The villagers turned against her, no longer seeing her as the kind, wise older sister, but as the murderer who had destroyed her own flesh and blood. Her family, once loving and supportive, struggled to understand what had driven her to commit such a heinous act. The guilt consumed her every waking moment, and she realized with a heavy heart that the love she had sought could never be hers. In the quiet solitude of her own mind, Amina finally understood the truth: love cannot be forced. True love is built on honesty, respect, and selflessness, qualities she had abandoned in her pursuit of something selfish. She had tried to shape her destiny through lies and manipulation, but in the end, it was only her own misery she had created. As the village slowly healed from the tragedy she had caused, Amina was left with the consequences of her jealousy, greed, and obsession. The pain of her sister's death, and the loss of everything she had hoped for, would be her burden to carry forever. The shocking end was not just the end of her sister's life, but the end of the life Amina had once known, leaving her with nothing but regret and the haunting knowledge that love built on deceit could never bring happiness.